A 6-year-old girl begged her father not to send her on the school bus, but he ignored her cries. What she endured in silence will break your heart. And what her father did next changed everything. This story will challenge the way you think about listening, parenting, and what it really means to show up. Watch until the end. It's a wake-up call every family needs. If this moves you, like the video and subscribe so you never miss another story that truly matters. Layla stood frozen at the edge of the sidewalk, her tiny hands clenched into fists, tears streaking down her cheeks as the big yellow school bus hissed to a stop in front of her. Her backpack sagged on one shoulder, slightly too heavy for her 6-year-old frame, and her red sneakers scraped anxiously against the pavement. It wasn't the first time she had reacted this way, but something about this morning felt different. Her dad, David, stood beside her with his arms crossed and eyes narrowed in frustration. The smell of lukewarm coffee clung to his shirt, a reminder of the rushed morning already gone wrong. He was late for work again, and the stress of unpaid bills and a growing to-do list sat heavily on his shoulders. Layla's sobs pierced the quiet neighborhood street, but David barely flinched. To him, this was just another episode in a series of dramatic mornings. He had heard it all before. Her stomach hurt, her socks didn't feel right, she forgot a book, or her head was spinning. This time it was that the kids were mean. She said they teased her, pushed her, called her names. But to David, it sounded like the usual childhood struggles every kid faced. He had been taught to tough things out, and he believed it was part of growing up. So he told her she needed to be strong. He reminded her that life wouldn't always be easy and that hiding from small problems wouldn't help her in the long run. He didn't shout, but his voice was firm. When she didn't move, he reached out, placed a steady hand on her arm, and guided her toward the first step of the bus. Her knees buckled. She collapsed to the ground, crying harder, her voice rising in panic. The bus driver, a quiet man who rarely made eye contact, sat still in his seat and watched without a word. The door stayed open, the engine humming, waiting. David glanced around and noticed curtains twitching in nearby windows. The neighbors were watching. That made it worse. With a tense sigh, he helped her up and nudged her gently onto the first step. She didn't resist this time, but she didn't say anything either. Her face had changed. There was no more fear, just a blank, hollow look that unsettled him more than her screaming ever had. The bus pulled away slowly, and David stood there alone on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, watching the taillights disappear around the corner. For a brief moment, he felt something in his chest twist. That look in her eyes didn't feel like a tantrum. It felt like something deeper, something he might have missed. That evening, the house was quiet. Layla's mom, Elena, was working a night shift at the clinic, so it was just the two of them at the dinner table. David made her favorite, mac and cheese from the box with extra shredded cheddar on top, but she barely touched it. He tried to ask about her day, and she only shrugged. He asked if she sat with anyone at lunch, and she said no. When he asked why, she mumbled that they didn't want her there. He let out a slow breath and told her that everyone feels left out sometimes. But in the pit of his stomach, guilt was starting to settle. The usual explanations he had always told himself suddenly felt thinner, less convincing. He couldn't shake the image of her kneeling on the sidewalk that morning, screaming not out of rebellion, but something else. Something he hadn't been willing to see. As she got up from the table and walked toward her room without saying goodnight, David stared at her untouched plate. Maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been exaggerating. Maybe this wasn't just another hard day at school. That night, after Layla had quietly excused herself from the dinner table and disappeared into her room, David sat alone, staring at her untouched food. The mac and cheese, now cold and clumped, felt like a symbol of everything he had overlooked. He picked at his own plate absent-mindedly, not because he was hungry but because he needed something to do with his hands. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual. Without Elena around to fill the space with her soft humming or the occasional clatter from the kitchen, the quiet pressed in like a weight. He glanced at the hallway, half expecting Layla to come out with one of her bedtime requests, a glass of water, another story, or a question that didn't really need an answer. But tonight, she stayed in her room. No footsteps, no soft voice calling out. Just quiet. That was when it hit him. Her silence wasn't peaceful. It was guarded. The next morning started like any other. David got up groggy, showered quickly, and poured himself a cup of coffee. As he sat at the kitchen table scrolling through emails on his phone, he heard the faint shuffle of small feet behind him. Layla stood there already dressed in her school uniform, her backpack strapped tightly to her back. Her hair was neatly braided, Elena had done it the night before, and she looked polished, but empty. Her usual whines, the excuses, the begging to skip the bus, were gone. She didn't say anything. She just nodded when he said good morning, barely looked at him, and quietly slipped on her shoes. On the walk to the curb, David kept glancing down at her, searching for signs of emotion, some hint of how she was feeling. But she stayed quiet, eyes straight ahead, fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. When the bus turned the corner and came into view, something inside David stirred. For the first time, he didn't feel annoyed by the morning ritual. He felt nervous. She turned to him just once, and it wasn't to protest. She didn't ask for help. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, her face unreadable, then turned back toward the road. As the doors swung open and the driver gave his usual nod, Layla climbed aboard without hesitation. No drama, no tears, just that quiet, mechanical obedience that felt more alarming than all the previous breakdowns combined. She walked down the aisle, her small frame barely filling the width of the walkway, and took her seat near the back. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. And David stood there, frozen, long after it turned out of sight. His stomach felt tight. Something wasn't right. The silence, the way she hadn't resisted, how she looked back at him that one time. There was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not fear. Not defiance. But something deeper. Resignation. All the mornings he had brushed her off, told her to toughen up, insisted she was just being dramatic, replayed in his mind like a broken record. He remembered the tone of her voice when she begged him, how desperate she sounded. But he hadn't listened. Not really. He had told himself he was teaching her resilience, that kids needed to learn how to face their problems. But now, with the memory of her blank stare lingering, he wondered if he'd misunderstood everything. What if this wasn't just a child avoiding school? What if she had been asking for help all along, in the only way she knew how? That question stuck with him all day. It followed him to work, sat beside him during meetings, and hung in the air during phone calls. Every time he tried to focus, his mind drifted back to Layla, to her silence, to her face at the curb. When he came home that evening, Elena was getting ready for her shift at the clinic. He told her everything seemed fine with Layla, that she had gotten on the bus without any issues. He didn't mention the heaviness in his chest or the guilt curling in his gut. After Elena left, David peeked into Layla's room. She was sitting on the floor coloring, her headphones on. She didn't notice him. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. He stood there for a moment, then closed the door quietly. That night, David couldn't sleep. The question kept echoing. What if she had been telling the truth all along, and he had been too distracted, too proud, or too tired to hear it? What if her silence wasn't a sign that things had gotten better, but that she had given up on being heard? David woke up the next morning before the alarm even had a chance to buzz. The sky outside was still a pale gray, and the world hadn't quite stirred yet. He sat at the edge of his bed, holding a cup of coffee that quickly went cold in his hands. The image of Layla from the day before lingered in his mind. How she walked onto that bus without a word, how her little body seemed to shrink as she climbed the steps, and how her eyes, so full of life just weeks ago, looked distant and dim. He couldn't shake it. He didn't tell Elena his plan. She was still asleep after a late shift, and there wasn't much to say anyway. He wasn't even sure what he was doing. He just knew something didn't sit right. He told himself it was probably nothing, but part of him wasn't convinced. After getting Layla ready for school and walking her to the curb like always, he gave her a quiet nod. She looked up at him, no smile, no protest. That blank expression was still there. She boarded the bus like she was walking into a place she had learned not to fight anymore. Once the bus pulled away, David quickly got into his car and began to follow from a safe distance. He kept several car lengths behind, careful not to be noticed. He told himself he was only doing this for peace of mind, that maybe if he saw with his own eyes that everything was fine, he could finally let go of the unease in his chest. But as he watched the bus move slowly through traffic, He felt more like a father trying to make up for a mistake he had only just realized he made. At a red light, the bus came to a full stop. David's car crept up alongside it, just enough to see into the windows without drawing attention. He scanned the rows until he spotted her. There was Layla, sitting in the very last seat by the window, knees drawn up, backpack clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. She wasn't looking around. Her eyes were closed, and her head rested lightly against the glass. Then he saw them. 2 older boys a few seats ahead of her, laughing and turning back to throw wadded-up paper in her direction. One of them reached over and tugged her hair while the other pointed and laughed. David's stomach dropped. The driver didn't react, didn't even glance in the mirror. Layla didn't flinch. She didn't push them away or cry. She just sat still, eyes shut tight, like she had learned the best way to survive was not to respond at all. That broke him more than anything. She wasn't being dramatic. She wasn't exaggerating. She had been enduring, quietly every single day. David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He could feel his face flush with a mixture of shame, anger, and heartbreak. He had forced her to go. He had lectured her about being strong while she was being broken in ways he hadn't even bothered to see. As the light turned green and the bus rolled forward, David followed it all the way to the school. He parked nearby and watched her step off, shoulders hunched, her small figure disappearing into the flow of students. No one greeted her. No one walked with her. He stayed in the car for a while, staring out the windshield, barely blinking. He had been so sure he was teaching her resilience. He thought he was preparing her for life by not giving in to what he assumed were childish fears. But what he had really done was teach her that even her own father wouldn't believe her. That realization hit him harder than anything else ever had. It wasn't just about bullying anymore. It was about the quiet way she had started to carry herself. The way her voice had grown small. The way she had stopped asking for help. That night, he didn't say much. Layla went to bed early, and he stood outside her door longer than he cared to admit, just listening to the faint rustle of her turning pages in a book. He knew tomorrow couldn't be like today. Tomorrow, something had to change. And this time, he wouldn't stay in the car. That night, David didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the room lit faintly by the glow of the street lamp outside. Every time he closed his eyes, the same image played over and over in his mind. Layla sitting at the back of that bus, arms wrapped around her backpack, head bowed, while those boys laughed and threw paper at her. Her stillness, the way she didn't even try to defend herself, haunted him. She had stopped crying not because the pain had gone away, but because she had learned that crying didn't make a difference. That truth settled on his chest like a weight too heavy to move. He kept thinking about how he had dismissed her. How he told her to toughen up. How he insisted she was being dramatic. He remembered all the mornings when she begged him with tears in her eyes, and all the times he told her that the world wouldn't go easy on her just because she was little. He thought he was helping her grow stronger. He thought he was preparing her for life. But now he knew he hadn't been helping her. He had been silencing her. The guilt wasn't loud or frantic. It was quiet and steady, like a slow ache that crept into every corner of his mind. He remembered how she didn't eat her dinner, how she said no one sat with her at school, how she barely looked at him when he asked how her day had been. All of those were signs, and he had missed every single one. He sat up in bed, rubbed his eyes, and looked at the clock. It was past midnight. He walked quietly down the hall and paused outside her door. There was no sound coming from inside. He placed a hand on the doorknob but didn't turn it. He didn't want to wake her. He just needed to be near her for a moment. To feel her presence and let the reality of his failure sink in. In that stillness, something inside him shifted. The kind of shift that only comes when a person finally sees something they've been blind to for too long. He had spent so much time trying to make her tough. He forgot that she was still just a little girl. A little girl who needed someone to listen, to believe her, to fight for her. And he hadn't done any of that. He thought about the way her hand trembled when she clutched her backpack. He thought about how the kids had looked right at her and still chose to be cruel. But most of all, he thought about how she had turned to him for help, and he turned her away. There was no fixing what had already happened. No apology would erase the morning she cried while he stood with arms crossed, convincing himself he was doing the right thing. But maybe if he started now, he could show her that he was still learning. That he could be better. That she still had a father who would show up, not just in words, but in action. He returned to his room, sat at the edge of the bed again, and made a quiet promise to himself. Tomorrow, he wouldn't stay behind. Tomorrow, he wouldn't assume. He would go with her. He would see it all. And more than that, he would let her see that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. It wasn't about rescuing her or making a scene. It was about letting her know that someone saw her pain, someone understood, and someone cared enough to stand beside her in it. For the first time in weeks, he felt clear. Not because things were better, but because he had finally opened his eyes to what really mattered. As the sky began to lighten outside, David remained awake, waiting for morning. It wouldn't undo the past, but it would be the beginning of something new. Not just for Layla, but for him too. David was already up when the sun started peeking through the blinds. The house was quiet, still heavy with the early morning hush that usually came before the day stirred to life. He didn't bother with coffee this time. He just sat at the kitchen table, fingers tapping slowly against the wood, waiting. Not for the clock to hit a certain time, but for Layla's soft footsteps to come down the hallway. He heard them eventually, light and careful, like she didn't want to disturb anything. She entered the room already dressed, her backpack tugging slightly at her shoulder. Her uniform was neat, her hair freshly braided. Elena must have done it before heading to bed the night before. Layla didn't say a word. She just nodded in acknowledgement, the same as every morning lately. David stood up. His voice was gentle when he spoke. He told her he was coming with her today. At first, she blinked in confusion, unsure if she'd heard him right. He explained he had spoken with the principal and gotten approval to visit the school. But more importantly, he wanted to ride the bus with her. Layla didn't respond, not with words. Her eyes widened just slightly, then returned to that quiet stare. She didn't ask why. Maybe part of her already knew. They walked to the bus stop in silence. The street was calm, the same as every morning, but it felt different. David's pace was slow, thoughtful. Layla's hands fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. When the bus came into view, he could feel her tense up just slightly. The bus pulled up and stopped with a familiar hiss. The driver looked surprised to see a grown man standing at the curb. David stepped up first and asked if it was all right if he rode along. The driver nodded, clearly unsure but unwilling to argue. Layla hesitated at the steps. Her dad was already halfway down the aisle, scanning the rows before motioning for her to join him. She sat beside him cautiously, clutching her backpack like it was armor. The ride started quietly. Kids murmured among themselves, casting curious glances toward the middle row where David and Layla sat. The older kids in the back whispered a little louder, trying to figure out why a grown man was on their bus. Then it happened. A voice from the back, loud enough to be heard clearly. One of the boys, David recognized him from the day before, mocked, saying the crybaby brought her daddy. Laughter followed, a few stifled gasps, and even one dramatic whisper of disbelief. David stood up slowly. The noise died instantly. All eyes were on him as he turned and walked toward the back of the bus. The boy who had spoken, Brandon, shrunk slightly into his seat. David stopped in front of him, not angry, just steady. He asked the boy's name, and when he answered, David spoke clearly. He said he knew what had been going on. That throwing paper, pulling hair, and laughing at someone smaller wasn't strength, it was cowardice. And then he turned to the rest of the kids. He reminded them that sitting by and watching someone get hurt without speaking up made them just as guilty. He told them they weren't just kids, they were people, capable of kindness or cruelty, and every day they had the chance to choose. No one responded. No one laughed. Not even a whisper. When the bus finally reached the school, David stood up and stepped off first, turning to help Layla down. She took his hand. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. They walked together toward the entrance, and as they did, the crowd of students naturally made space for them. Some stared, some murmured quietly, but most just watched. Layla looked up at her dad, a small expression of something almost like relief starting to bloom on her face. She told him he didn't have to come. He looked back and gently said he did. That he should have come the first time she asked. She didn't say anything more, but the way she squeezed his hand as they crossed the threshold said everything he needed to hear. Avid didn't go straight to work that day. After walking Layla to her classroom and making sure she was safely inside, he headed straight to the school office and asked to speak with the principal. The secretary looked surprised, but politely asked him to wait. He sat in the lobby, replaying the entire morning in his mind. The silent tension on the bus, the mocking voice from the back, the way the kids had fallen quiet when he spoke. It wasn't just about standing up for Layla anymore. It was about making sure no other kid on that bus ever felt the way she had. When the principal finally invited him in, David didn't hold back. He laid it all out. The bullying, the silence of the driver, the months of emotional stress his daughter had been carrying, and most of all, his own failure to act sooner. He didn't blame the school blindly. He acknowledged that he too had missed the signs, ignored the warning cries, and only stepped in when the damage had already been done. But he insisted that something had to change. Not just for Layla, but for every quiet kid riding the bus in fear, hoping someone would notice. The principal listened closely. She looked genuinely concerned, nodding as he spoke. She asked questions, took notes, and promised immediate follow-up. She assured David that the bus driver would be reviewed, the students involved would be spoken to, and stronger systems for reporting bullying would be put into place. It sounded sincere. But David knew that promises didn't heal wounds. Actions did. That evening, after putting Layla to bed, he sat at the kitchen table again. But this time, he didn't just sit in silence. He opened his laptop and began to type. He wasn't sure what he was writing at first, only that he needed to get it all out. The story, the guilt, the pain of not listening when it mattered, it poured out of him in honest, simple words. He wasn't trying to be eloquent. He just wanted to be real. He finished the letter around midnight and sent it to the local newspaper. He didn't expect much. Maybe a few people would read it. Maybe it would start a conversation. That was enough for him. But within 2 days, the story spread far beyond their small town. People shared it across social media, parents reached out, and emails flooded into the school. Other families admitted their children had struggled too. Some had never spoken up. Others had been brushed off, just like Layla. The school was suddenly at the center of a conversation it could no longer avoid. The administration responded quickly. The bus driver was quietly replaced with someone new, someone trained to recognize signs of distress and speak up when something felt off. The school updated its bullying policy, adding anonymous reporting options and clear consequences for repeated behavior. Staff were trained to identify red flags not just in classrooms, but in hallways and on buses. A new phrase started showing up in newsletters and on posters in the halls. Safe rides, safe school. But the biggest change wasn't the rules or the staff, it was the culture. Kids began to talk. Some apologized to Layla. Others told their own stories. Teachers started paying closer attention. And while no system is perfect, there was a new sense of accountability in the air, like the school had collectively opened its eyes. David saw the difference, too. At the bus stop, he noticed parents talking more with their kids. Some even stayed a little longer in the mornings to wave goodbye. He received messages from strangers thanking him for speaking up. A few even admitted they were inspired to be more involved in their own children's routines. Through it all, David remained grounded. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He just wanted to be the kind of father his daughter could trust. The kind who listened. The kind who acted when it counted. And even though nothing could erase the pain Layla had endured, the ripple effect of one moment, of finally paying attention, was now reaching farther than he ever expected. It didn't happen overnight. The changes came slowly, gently, like the way spring slips into view after a long winter. At first, it was the little things. Layla started sleeping better. The tossing and turning, the muffled cries in the middle of the night, those began to fade. Then came the mornings. She still got up quietly, but there was a calmness to her routine now. She brushed her hair without being asked. She packed her lunch with a bit more care. And when she stood at the curb waiting for the bus, She didn't fidget with her shirt quite as much. David noticed every shift. He had made a habit of walking her to the stop each morning, not out of obligation, but because it had become one of his favorite parts of the day. Sometimes they talked, other times they just stood in silence. But even in the quiet, there was a closeness that hadn't been there before. She didn't flinch when he reached for her hand. And when the bus arrived, she no longer hesitated. A new driver greeted the kids every morning with a warm smile and gentle voice. It made a difference. There was a new sense of order on the bus, like the air had been cleared. The boy who had bullied Layla kept his head down now. He didn't look her way. And while David knew that a single lecture wouldn't change a child completely, he also believed that sometimes being seen, being called out, was enough to plant a seed. Layla didn't sit in the back anymore. She had found a new spot near the middle, right by the window. And beside her sat Sophie, a soft-spoken girl who had quietly introduced herself a few days after everything happened. They clicked quickly, bonding over books and drawing, two things Layla had always loved but had pushed aside when she felt so alone. Sophie started saving her a seat each morning. Layla would climb aboard, spot her friend waving, and for the first time in weeks, her lips would curl into a small smile. That smile became David's anchor. It told him they were on the right path, even if they still had more healing to do. At school, things felt different too. Layla's teacher had been more attentive, and the principal checked in with her regularly. Other students, perhaps nudged by their own parents or their growing awareness, began to treat her with more kindness. She didn't become instantly popular, but she was no longer invisible. And that mattered. One afternoon, David picked her up early from school for a dentist appointment. As they walked down the hall, a classmate called out goodbye. Layla waved back without hesitation. It was such a simple gesture, but David felt something swell in his chest. She was coming back to herself. At home, the change showed in quieter ways. She asked more questions at dinner. She laughed at a silly commercial. She began reading out loud again, something she had stopped doing for a while. And one evening, while sketching a picture of a tree, she turned to David and said she wanted to plant one someday, a big one, with a swing. He smiled and told her they would. David had changed too. He listened more now. Not just to the words, but to the silences in between. He didn't just ask how her day was. He sat with her long enough to hear the full answer. And even on days when nothing big happened, he made sure she knew he was there. The bond between them had always been strong, but now it was different. It was rooted in understanding, in showing up, in owning mistakes and trying to do better. Healing doesn't announce itself with big moments. It comes in fragments, in shared glances, in quiet laughter, in the way a child once too afraid to speak now tells you stories before bed. For Layla, healing meant feeling safe again. And for David, it meant learning how to be the father she needed, not just the one he thought he had to be. Together, they were learning that love, when paired with action, really could make things better. Some nights, after the house had gone quiet and Layla was tucked into bed, David would sit in the hallway outside her door and just listen. Not because he expected to hear anything, but because that quiet had come to mean something different now. It was no longer filled with worry or regret. It was a soft reminder of how far they had come. A few weeks had passed since he rode the bus with her. Since that morning when everything shifted, when the truth of what she had endured opened his eyes to what he had missed. Since then, David had changed in ways that surprised even himself. He found new routines, not out of guilt, but out of a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly be there. He woke up earlier now, not rushing through the mornings, but moving with intention. He made breakfast even when Layla insisted she wasn't hungry, just in case she changed her mind. He walked her to the bus stop every day, even when she said she'd be okay. He didn't hover, but he didn't disappear either. His presence became consistent, quiet, and steady, the kind that builds trust without needing to say much. One morning, as they stood at the curb, she turned to him and said the seat by Sophie was still being saved. He smiled, but didn't say anything. That simple comment said enough. She was no longer stepping onto that bus with fear in her chest. She was stepping into her day with confidence. In the evenings, David made a point to be present. They cooked dinner together on weekends, played board games, and sometimes just sat side by side while she drew and he read. It didn't need to be a grand gesture. He had learned that most love is found in the little things, in the time you give without being asked, in the way you listen, and in the spaces you choose to show up. Layla had changed too. Not in loud, dramatic ways, but in the kind of shifts that only someone close could notice. She stood a little taller. Her voice carried more easily. And every now and then, she'd burst into a story from school, excited to tell him about something funny that happened or how she and Sophie had traded snacks at lunch. And then came the night that stayed with him more than any other. He was tucking her in, pulling the blanket up to her chin like he always did. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of her nightlight. She reached out and grabbed his hand. Her fingers were small but sure. "Thank you for coming on the bus, Daddy." The words came out quietly, like a secret she had been saving for just the right moment. He looked at her, heart already in his throat, and told her he was sorry he hadn't come sooner. But she shook her head slightly and said something that would echo in his mind for a long time. "You came when it mattered." That was the moment everything came full circle. She wasn't holding on to the hurt anymore. She had let it go, not because it didn't matter, but because she had been seen, believed, and protected. And David, once so sure of how parenting should look, now understood that listening, truly listening, is the most powerful thing a parent can do. The story didn't end with a perfect solution. The world outside was still complicated, and kids could still be unkind. But Layla now had the confidence that came from knowing someone had her back. And David had the wisdom that comes from learning to slow down, to hear what's not being said, and to make room for a child's voice even when it shakes. Love, after all, isn't just a feeling. It's a decision, made daily, to show up, to grow, to try again. And in that quiet space outside her bedroom door, David knew he'd never stop choosing that love. One morning, one bus ride, one bedtime at a time. Sometimes, the loudest cries are the ones spoken in silence. This story between a father and daughter reminds us that listening, truly listening, goes beyond hearing words. It's about noticing what's unsaid, sensing when something feels off, and caring enough to pause and ask again. In our busy lives, especially as parents, grandparents, or caregivers, it's easy to mistake a child's fear for fussiness, or their hesitation for weakness. But when we slow down and lean in with empathy, we give others, especially the smallest among us, the safety to be honest. Layla's journey teaches us that children don't need perfect parents. They need present ones. And David's change shows us that it's never too late to show up, admit our blind spots, and choose love over pride. This is not just a parenting lesson, it's a human one. Whether you're raising kids, caring for aging parents, or simply trying to be a better friend, remember this: our quiet attention can be someone else's turning point. If this message resonated with you, let us know in the comments. What kind of stories would you like to see next? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another meaningful story that could shift a perspective or soften a heart.